Hi friends, it's Miss Mora here again, and I'm here today to read to you chapter 9 in our book Frindle. Now yesterday when I was reading chapter 7 and 8, I got cut off before I got to finish chapter 8. These videos here on Class Dojo can only be 8 minutes long, so I get cut off right at the end of 8 minutes. So I'm going to finish reading the very end of chapter 8, and then I will go into chapter 9 with you. Now, if you didn't get to watch that video yesterday, if you haven't watched some of the other chapters, all of the chapters 1 through 8 are right down below on Class Dojo. So if you scroll down, whether you're on a computer, if you're on a phone, if you scroll down on your screen, you can see all of the chapters below. So go ahead and watch those before you watch this video. Today we're going to read the rest of chapter 8 and chapter 9. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Where we left off in chapter 8, Mrs. Granger was talking to Nick about his idea of using the word Frindle instead of pen, and she was not happy about that idea. She also was handing him an envelope, and Nick was confused about what that envelope was. She wouldn't tell him what was in it. Here we go. Walking to school the next day, Pete had a great idea. How about if we see if we can get every kid in the whole 5th grade to go up and ask Mrs. Granger, "Can I borrow a Frindle?" "Do you mean, Mrs. Granger, may I borrow a Frindle?" said Dave. "Gotta use good manners. Don't want to upset dangerous Grangers." "Sounds good to me," said Nick. "She can't keep everyone after school, can she?" Almost 80 kids stayed after school with Mrs. Granger that day. They filled her room and spilled out into the hallway. The principal had to stay late to help, and they had to arrange 2 special late buses to get all the kids home. And the next day, all the 5th graders did it again, and so did all of the other students, over 200 kids. Parents called to complain. The school bus drivers threatened to go on strike, and then the school board and the superintendent got involved. And about this time, the principal of Lincoln Elementary School paid a little visit to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Allen. Those are Nick's parents. She wanted to talk to them about their son, the one in 5th grade, the one named Nick. Chapter 9, Chess. Mrs. Margaret Chatham had been principal of Lincoln Elementary School for 18 years. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Allen because they had all served together on the building committee when the old Lincoln School had been torn down and the new one was built 6 years ago. When she telephoned on the afternoon of October 1st to set up the meeting, Mrs. Chatham had asked Nick to be there, too. It was 6:30 when she knocked, and Nick opened the door. "Good evening, Nick," she said. No smile. "Hi, Mrs. Chatham," said Nick, backing away as she filled the doorway. She was a large person, as tall as Nick's dad, with wide shoulders. Nick guessed she would play a linebacker on a football team because that's what his dad had played in college. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Allen," she said, stepping into the living room. She was wearing a large black raincoat with a red silk scarf tied loosely around her neck. She kept her coat on, but took off the scarf and tucked it in her left pocket. She shook hands stiffly with both of Nick's parents before sitting down on the chair to the left of the couch. Nick's mom and dad sat on the couch, and Nick sat on the rocking chair that faced Mrs. Chatham across the low coffee table. "This is not an easy visit for me. We are having some trouble at school, and it appears that Nick is in the middle of it." Then, while Nick's parents listened, Mrs. Chatham laid out the story as she saw it. Nick encouraging the other kids to use his new word, Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined 5th grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and a general feeling that there was a rebellion at the school, with no one respecting any of the rules. It's a picture of Mrs. Chatham visiting. Nick watched his mom and dad while Mrs. Chatham talked, looking from one face to the other. His dad was listening carefully, nodding and frowning. He looked embarrassed about the trouble, but his mom looked kind of annoyed. And when Mrs. Chatham finished her story, Nick's mom was the first one to speak. "But doesn't this all seem like kind of a fuss about something pretty silly?" Nick sat quietly, but in his mind he shouted, Hurrah for Mom! Hurrah for mothers everywhere! His mom wasn't annoyed with him. She was annoyed with Mrs. Granger, maybe even annoyed with Mrs. Chatham. This was getting interesting. Mrs. Allen was still talking to the principal. I mean, is there really any harm in the children making up a funny word and saying it? Does there have to be a rule that a word like this may not be used? Mrs. Chatham sighed. Yes, I suppose it does seem silly, but Mrs. Granger thinks that it's rather like keeping children away from saying ain't. There have to be standards. That's why we have dictionaries. And really, the problem isn't so much the word itself, it's the lack of respect for authority. Mrs. Allen said, Mrs. Granger's right about that. There have to be standards. We can't have kids walking around saying ain't, can we? That's when Nick piped in. You know that big dictionary in Mrs. Granger's room? The word ain't is right there in the book. I looked it up, and there it was. I don't see why I can't use the word if it's in the dictionary. Mrs. Granger even said that her big dictionary was the law. Nick looked from face to face. That stumped them all. He had just launched the first class thought grenade. Well, yes, but, I said their word ain't and even the word frindle, these are not the real issue here, said Mrs. Chatham. Mrs. Allen said, Well, I think the real issue is Mrs. Granger's reaction to a harmless little experiment with language. It's an overreaction. Don't you think so, Tom? And Mrs. Allen looked at her husband. It was Mr. Allen's turn to look from face to face. He was lost. Yes, well, I guess so. I mean, it's not like anybody's been hurt. I mean, it's not like vandalism or stealing or something. His sentence trailed off. He rubbed his chin and stared thoughtfully out the window. And while the three grown-ups sat there in an uncomfortable moment of silence, Nick had a sudden vision of what's really been going on there. It's like a chess game, Nick against Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger had just tried to end the game by using her queen, Mrs. Chatham, in her black raincoat. Nick didn't know it until the attack was underway, but he had a powerful defender of his own, his good old mom. Mrs. Chatham didn't stay much longer. There was a little more talk back and forth across the chessboard about how the children have a right to explore new ideas. Then Mr. Allen offered Mrs. Chatham some coffee and banana bread. She said, No thanks, I really must be going. She thanked Nick's parents, and they thanked her. Nick opened the door and said, Good night, Mrs. Chatham. Then the Black Queen put on a red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. And the chessmen, Nick's king and queen, had to agree the game would go on. That's the end of chapter 9, and we will read chapter 10 tomorrow. Bye, guys. Miss you and love you.